He is currently an associate professor of international relations at the Department of Government and School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and a senior fellow in the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council. His most recent book, A Time to Attack, The Looming Iranian Nuclear Threat, was published in 2014 and examines all aspects of the Iranian nuclear challenge, including the rationale behind the U.S. policy of ruling out containment as an option if diplomacy fails. It's actually a fantastic book. I actually just finished reading it myself a few months ago, and I would highly recommend that everybody check it out if they can. In addition to his work on his book, he's been published in the American Political Science Review, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, International Organization, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. He's also been a commentator on BBC, CNN, C-SPAN, NPR, and many other new media outlets. He was a foreign policy advisor to the 2012 Mitt Romney for President campaign and is a member of the John Hay Initiative. And from May 2010 to 2011, he served as a special advisor in the Office of the Secretary of Defense on Council of Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship, where he worked on defense and foreign strategy for Iran. He's also got a fellowship on the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, Harvard University, the National Science Foundation, Stanford University, and the University of California. He's a life member of the CFR as well. And you can follow him on Twitter at Kroenig. That's at Kroenig. So just to let you all know, to get in line to ask a question, just press *6 on your keypad, and that will have our system rank you and put you in a queue. And once Professor Kroenig is finished speaking, we will try to field as many of your Q&A questions as possible. Without further ado, Dr. Kroenig, please feel free to take it away. And we're very, very grateful to have you here at Met, and we look forward to what you have to say.
Great, Ross. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be doing this conference call, and thanks also for the kind words on the book. So here to talk about the Iran nuclear negotiations. As we all know, the deadline, the self-imposed deadline for the negotiations is tomorrow, June 30th. It's almost certain that the negotiators won't reach a deal by June 30th, but I think it's still likely that they will reach a deal sometime in early July. So my best guess will be they'll roll through this deadline, but within the next week or so, they'll announce a comprehensive deal. So I think in my talk today, I wanted to do 4 things to start us off. First, give the best case one can for the deal, give kind of the administration's defense of the deal. Second, I wanted to run through some of the common critiques of the deal. Third, I wanted to give my critique of the deal, which is more fundamental than I think many of the critiques currently being made in Washington. And then fourth, I wanted to talk about what a better strategy would look like, a better diplomatic strategy to arrive at a better deal. And then when I've finished doing those 4 things, happy to take questions and have a discussion. So first, what's the best case that can be made for this deal? Well, Iran's nuclear program is one of the most important national security challenges, emerging national security challenges in the world today. And if we get this deal and Iran abides by it, both pretty big ifs, but if those things happen, Iran will not be able to build nuclear weapons because it cuts off its major pathways to the bomb. As you may know, there are 2 ways to make nuclear weapons. To make the fuel for nuclear weapons, you can either reprocess plutonium or enrich uranium. This deal would put caps on the enrichment program that would prevent Iran from enriching up to weapons grade, and it would also force Iran to redo the reactor at Iraq, which would make it less suitable for producing plutonium. Second, to make sure that Iran's not cheating on the deal, the administration claims that it will have intrusive inspections. And sometimes they've claimed inaccurately that these would be the most intrusive inspections ever. You can debate that. But what is unusual about the inspections regime that's being proposed is that it would monitor Iran's nuclear production from all the way from the uranium mines through the various processes of milling, converting the uranium to uranium hexafluoride gas, and enrichment. So there would be fairly intrusive inspections, again, at least as envisioned. Third, the administration claims that they can maintain pressure because they argue if Iran cheats or when the deal expires in 10 years or so, something we'll come back to, the sunset provision, but they argue that they maintain all their various sources of leverage because they're negotiating snapback sanctions. In other words, they claim that if they get the deal, they won't lift sanctions completely. Rather, they'll keep the sanctions architecture in place while providing sanctions relief, and therefore, if Iran cheats, that the sanctions architecture could snap back into place. And they also argue in terms of maintaining leverage that at the end of the day, they still have the military option, that if Iran cheats or if when the deal expires 10 years from now, a future U.S. president could always strike militarily Iran's nuclear facilities. In their most honest moments, though, my contacts in the administration have said that they realize that this deal isn't great, that it would have been better to get a deal that had no enrichment whatsoever, but that it's a good deal, and that getting a better deal is impossible, and that this deal is better than the alternatives, which they claim are going to war with Iran or giving up and allowing Iran to have nuclear weapons. So that's their case for the deal. I just wanted to be fair about that up front. Now what's wrong with that position? So second, I'd like to move on to what some of the common critiques of the deal are floating around Washington. So one is it's just the nature of the regime, that you can't negotiate with the Iranians. You can't trust them to uphold their end of the bargain, that they've cheated on many of their agreements, including their nuclear agreements in the past, and we would be naive to think that they're going to uphold their end of the bargain. Now, I think some people see this criticism as superficial, but as Russ mentioned, my primary role as a political science professor at Georgetown, political science doesn't have many strong findings, but one of the strongest findings is that democracies are much more likely to keep their international commitments, all kinds of commitments, from trade agreements to agreements in the security realm, and autocracies like Iran are much more likely to cheat. So I think there is something to this. A good reason to believe that Iran, even if we get this deal, won't hold up its end of the bargain. Second problem with the deal that's often pointed out is the sunset provision, which I mentioned before. With the major components of this deal, the major restrictions on Iran's nuclear program will expire after 10 years. And so that means that after 10 years, Iran could ramp up its nuclear program without restriction. President Obama himself has said that Iran's breakout time, the time it would take Iran to produce one bomb's worth of material, would go to, I don't have the quote in front of me, but he said essentially that it would go to essentially zero after the deal expires. So really the best case you can make is that this would delay Iran's program for 10 years or so, but 10 years from now, all bets are off. Third problem is with the inspections. So the administration claims it has this comprehensive inspections regime, but of course, in any particular case, if the IAEA suspects that there may be activity going on in a certain facility, it would have to, at the end of the day, it requires Iran's permission to go to that facility. Iranians would have to let the inspectors in and open the gates. So the Iranians could simply refuse, and they've refused in the past, and just recently the Supreme Leader has said that all military sites are going to be off the table for inspections. So if that's the case, then it's very simple for Iran to cheat. They can simply do their nuclear work at military bases that are off limits to inspectors. Now, administration officials have said that if that's truly the Supreme Leader's red line, that there won't be a deal, that they would never agree to that. But I guess we'll see what happens over the coming days. But even if Iran agrees to allow inspectors at all these places, in any particular instance, they can always refuse, which would lead to a problem. Now, the administration claims that they have a process in place that if the IAEA wants to see a site and the Iranians refuse, that then it will go to a vote of the P5+1, and given that the United States and its allies have a majority in that group, that they'll win the vote, and then the Iranians would have to let them in. But the problem there is still the same. The Iranians would never have to let them in. They could always refuse, and then that would pose a problem. Fourth problem that's often raised is the breakout time, and is it sufficient or not? So people may know, apologize if this is too basic, but by breakout time we mean how much time would it take Iran to produce one bomb's worth of weapons-grade uranium. So if the Supreme Leader gave the order today to enrich as much as possible, as fast as possible, best estimates are that it would take roughly 2 to 3 months to produce the first bomb's worth of material. So the goal of the negotiations is to extend that breakout time. The administration claims that if we get the framework deal that was announced in March, that would extend Iran's breakout time to roughly 12 months. Others outside the administration who have looked at this, other technical experts have said that maybe that's a little too optimistic, and they've said maybe 8 months is more likely what we would get. But the criticism is, whether it's 8 months or 12 months, that it's just not enough. Because imagine if Iran tries to break out after a deal, imagine politically what would take place. First, there would be a debate about whether Iran is in fact cheating on the deal or not. Second, there would be a debate about whether we should do anything about it, what we should do about it. Third, there'd be a process about getting international and domestic support for whatever steps we need to take next. If the next step is sanctions, then there would need to be time for the sanctions to go into place and to start to have an effect on the Iranian economy. And then, as a last resort, there's always the military option. So many people look at that and say, realistically, 8 months isn't enough time for all of that to take place. It's still too much too close for comfort. Maybe it's better than 2 to 3 months, but it's not enough. Another common criticism is the possible military dimensions of Iran's program. So in addition to the enrichment program, we know that Iran has worked on actually designing the components for nuclear warheads in the past. The IAEA has strong evidence of that and wants to question Iran about that. Previously, the administration had said that would be an important part of any final deal. Just in the past week or so, Secretary Kerry had said that won't be a sticking point to the deal, that we would go ahead and sign a deal even before Iran comes forward on these possible military dimensions. And now the problem with that, of course, is that if we don't know how far Iran got on its nuclear weaponization work in the past, we don't really have an insight into how quickly it could build a bomb in the future once it had enough material. So getting clear answers on PMD should be a key component of any deal. Also, this administration argument that they keep the pressure in place is pretty suspect because we don't really have any experience with these snapback sanctions, and it's not clear whether that would work or not. And again, just imagine how this would work in practice, that we lift the sanctions on Iran but keep the architecture in place. Well, if we lift the sanctions, what's going to happen is foreign firms are going to start signing contracts with Iran. They're going to start making investments in Iran. And then imagine if Iran cheats and the sanctions so-called snap back into place. What are those firms going to do? Are they going to be willing to pull up roots and get out of Iran? Now, some would argue, well, this is a deterrent in the first place. That means that Iran won't get that much sanctions relief because those firms aren't going to go there in the first place. But once money starts flowing back into Iran because of the sanctions relief, it's going to be hard to turn that around. After all, it took a decade, really longer than a decade, to build the current sanctions regime. These things aren't that easy to assemble and disassemble, so we can't just turn them on and off like a light switch if Iran cheats. And then the final big criticism of the deal is it essentially gives a major signing bonus to the world's largest state sponsor of terror. The estimates are that Iran will get something like $150 billion in relief from unfrozen Iranian assets. And we know how problematic Iran's been in the region, supporting terrorist and proxy groups in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq. And so with more money, there will be more money to fund those kind of groups. Iran will just ramp up, likely, its destabilizing behavior in the region. So these are all the reasons to be concerned about the deal. But my critique of the deal is much more fundamental. So a lot of these critiques deal with the details, and that's been one of my frustrations with the debate so far, is that people are, I think, playing into the administration's hands by engaging on the details. But I think what's problem with this deal is much more fundamental, and that is that it was a mistake to go back on the zero enrichment demand altogether. And so to some people, these negotiations seem confusing, getting down into details about types of centrifuges and levels of enrichment. And the reason they're confusing is because, or the fact that they're confusing is a sign that this is a bad deal. If it's a good deal, like the Libya deal in 2003, where Colonel Gaddafi agreed to give up everything, it's quite clear this is not a good deal. So why do I say it was a mistake to give up on enrichment? Well, first, this has essentially been a key pillar of U.S. nonproliferation policy going back at least until 1946. I would say there's a 70-year history to this. So to understand, and again, I'm sorry if this is too basic, but basically the United States has always drawn a line between having nuclear technology, nuclear reactors that you can use for research or for producing power. That's always been permitted. But producing the fuel for those reactors has always been seen as problematic. Enriching uranium or reprocessing plutonium has always been seen as problematic because from the beginning of the nuclear era, scientists understood that if you could produce fuel, you could use that for either peaceful purposes or for nuclear weapons. And so really the balancing act the United States has tried to strike for 70 years in its nonproliferation policy is to permit or even promote peaceful uses of nuclear energy with reactors, but to prohibit the fuel making. And so the vast majority of countries on Earth today that have nuclear energy programs don't enrich their own uranium, they don't process plutonium. And I think that's an important point. I think the Iranians have been clever in their public diplomacy, and they make it seem like enrichment is central to their program, but it's really not. The vast majority of countries on Earth that have peaceful nuclear programs have the fuel supplied to them by other countries. They run the fuel in their reactors, and then they ship it back. And so the Iranians can have that kind of peaceful nuclear program if they want. The problem is making the fuel themselves. And so as I said, the U.S. has tried to enforce this principle for over the past 70 years, going back to 1946, the McMahon Act cut off U.S. nuclear cooperation even with Britain and Canada, two of our closest allies, two countries that worked with us on the Manhattan Project because we were worried about the proliferation implications. You can go through to the 1970s. The United States set up this nuclear suppliers group that puts strict restrictions on the transfer of enrichment and reprocessing because of the proliferation risk. With our friends, we got really tough, forcing them to shut down enrichment reprocessing programs. So in the 1970s, Taiwan and South Korea were both pursuing reprocessing. We got really tough and said you can choose between this nuclear program or the U.S. security umbrella, but you can't have both. And in the end, they shut their programs down. Now, we have negotiated with rogue regimes over illicit nuclear programs in the past, Libya and North Korea, but in both of those cases, our terms were clear and uncompromising. Sensitive nuclear technologies, enrichment and reprocessing would not be allowed. So the 1994 agreed framework, which in the end didn't work, but we made it clear that reprocessing wouldn't be allowed. We later found out that North Korea had been cheating from day one, enriching uranium. And when we found that out, we tried another round of negotiations, but in those negotiations, we demanded nothing less than the, quote, complete, verifiable, and irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear infrastructure. We also got a nuclear deal with Libya in 2003, as I mentioned earlier. In that deal, Libya agreed to give up everything, give up its entire enrichment program. Within weeks of striking the deal, U.S. military aircraft were in Libya, packing up crates of centrifuges and flying them out of the country. So this deal with Iran is unprecedented. As the New York Times has said, it is a landmark deal, but I think a landmark deal in the wrong direction. This is literally the first time in the history of U.S. nonproliferation policy where we've been willing to bargain over not the existence of an enrichment program, but the size of an enrichment program in a country of clear proliferation concern. So that's troubling, I think. And it's troubling because it won't have the effect that we hope it'll have. I think allowing Iran to keep this enrichment program, allowing Iran to keep latent nuclear weapons capability will mean that Iran will eventually build nuclear weapons. This program might delay it, the deal might delay it. The deal might help to kind of manage expectations as Iran transitions into the nuclear club. But it's hard for me to see how this deal prevents Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons over the, say, medium term. Moreover, I think it leads to a potential arms race in the region. Allowing Iran to keep a nuclear weapons capability just months away from breakout creates incentives for other countries in the region to try to acquire nuclear weapons in response. And you've already seen representatives from the UAE, representatives from Saudi Arabia saying that they'll build whatever nuclear capabilities that Iran has. So maybe this won't be as extreme as a nuclear arms race in response to a fully fledged nuclear-armed Iran, but I think they will start putting the capabilities in place, start to build up a nuclear infrastructure that could lead to a future nuclear arms race. But more broadly, it sets a dangerous precedent. So as I said, the United States has been telling all countries, even its allies, for several decades that enrichment and reprocessing are not allowed. And the South Koreans are a country that in recent years have expressed interest in reprocessing. But now it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, after this deal for the United States to go to other countries, including its own allies, and say, well, we trust Tehran with this sensitive nuclear technology, but we don't trust you, our allies in Seoul. And so I'm afraid that this would also lead to really a weakening and an undermining of this principle of U.S. nonproliferation policy over the past several decades, and could lead to proliferation around the world and to a weakening of the nonproliferation regime. And to make things worse, this is all happening with the international community's stamp of approval after a deal. After a deal, the 5 UN Security Council members in Germany are going to sit down, sign an agreement, and say that they approve of Iran with this nuclear weapons breakout capability. There's a good argument to be made, I think, that if Iran is going to enrich, it would be much better for Iran to be on the wrong side of international law, for it to be doing so in isolation and under sanction, rather than getting the international community stamp of approval, which looks like what's going to happen in the coming week. So if you take a step back, this outcome is really, really kind of puzzling, because for a long time, zero enrichment was a red line for the U.S. negotiations. That was the Bush administration position, and that was even President Obama's position. I can point to a number of statements in 2007, 2008, where President Obama said that his goal would be to, quote, stop Iran's uranium enrichment program. And so we've come way off that line, from zero to thousands of centrifuges. At the same time, Iran and Iran's supreme leader have stuck to their red lines. Throughout, he has said that enrichment is a red line, that they will never give up enrichment. Throughout, he has said he will never shut down any of the nuclear facilities. He has said he'll never destroy any centrifuges. And according to the framework deal, he's going to get all of those things. And so the reason the gap has been closed over the past few years is largely because the P5+1 and the United States has come to Iran's position, not because we've met in the middle. And I say this is a puzzle because if you just look objectively, the United States and the international community is in a much stronger position. The United States is the world's greatest superpower, has built this international sanctions regime that has really been had destroyed Iran's economy. At the end of the day, the United States does have an effective military option. Iran's nuclear facilities can be a pile of rubble tomorrow morning if that's the direction the U.S. president decided to go in. And we have international law on our side. Iran's in violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions. On the other hand, Iran has no leverage whatsoever. It's on the wrong side of international law. Its economy is being crushed by sanctions, and its nuclear program is completely vulnerable to U.S. airstrikes. Yet somehow Iran is emerging with the better hand in this negotiation. So it's one thing to complain, but what can we do better? And this is one argument the administration makes, is that there are a lot of complaints of the deal, but that there are no better alternatives out there. Even though it's not a perfect option, it's better than the alternatives. And I think that's not the case. I think there is a better way forward. And I think the better way forward is pretty clear, and that is to simply give the Iranians a choice, to say we're open to a reasonable deal. We'll give Iran a peaceful nuclear program if that's what it wants. It can have a peaceful nuclear program just like Mexico and many other countries on Earth. They can have reactors, but they can't enrich uranium. And they can get uranium fuel on the market, have other countries supply it to them, ship the spent fuel rods back, just like most every other country on Earth does that has a nuclear program. And in exchange for that, they can have sanctions relief. Or if they insist on enriching uranium, insist on violating international law in this way, we'll return to the pressure trap. We'll increase sanctions and set clear military red lines of what advances in Iran's nuclear program would necessitate a U.S. military strike. Now, the administration has often claimed, well, if we do that, the only alternative to this deal is war, that it would mean immediate war. But I don't think that's the case if we follow this strategy. I think if we're clear about our red lines, the Iranians don't want a war with the United States. and people have kind of poked fun at Benjamin Netanyahu's cartoonish bomb, setting out red lines at the UN several years ago. But in my view, that worked. The Iranians didn't cross that red line. And so I think if we're clear about what our red lines are, the Iranians won't dash past the red line, and that will give us more time for the sanctions to work. Iran, if they insist on enriching, would still be on the wrong side of international law. And in the worst case scenario, if they did cross the red lines, then we can strike the facilities. It's a viable option. Now, I understand that it would be difficult for President Obama to make this kind of about face. He couldn't say, never mind about this agreed framework, I'm going in a completely different direction. I think it would be great if he were willing to do that, but I think that's unlikely. And so I think what it's going to take is a new president coming to power in 2016. And all the Republican candidates have said that they're opposed to this deal. Governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker, has even said that he would tear it up on day one if he were elected. And so I think one thing I want to think about, and I think we should all be thinking about, is what would that look like if Obama strikes this bad deal? How can we walk it back in 2016? What's the kind of strategy we would need to build international support and take this in a new direction? So those are some of the things I've been thinking about recently, and we got started a little bit late, so maybe I'll stop a little bit short of 30 minutes and give us time for Q&A and discussion. So thank you.
And that was absolutely fantastic, very, very informative. I don't even know where to begin with my questions, but you did answer quite a few of them because I just do have so many still, and I think we all really do. That being said, like I said earlier, I'll take the moderator's prerogative and just go ahead and start us off. So, the first question that I really have is, as someone, who researches this issue, we at Met do a good amount of work on this issue, and we've done a lot of fact sheets. I'd actually encourage everybody on the phone call right now to, after this call is over, if you have any questions about the basics on this, to look more into Professor Kroenig's work and go onto our website, www.emetonline.org, to check out some of our primers. It'll give you a very good understanding. They're built for regular people to read. You don't need to have expertise in the issues to understand them. But that being said, one of the things that I think you touched on that has been a concern of mine, and I'm sure a concern of many people on the call, is the reality of the snapback provision. As you mentioned in your talk, that's never really been done before, but strangely enough, we have this kind of assumption that it's going to work, it seems. Every time there's a criticism put forth, there seems to be this idea, well, no, it'll snap back. But could you maybe go into a little bit more detail as to the difficulty that it took to bring the permanent members on board with the sanctions regime? For example, I'm thinking of right now China and Russia, given their current posturing, given their aggressive moves lately in foreign relations. What really is the reality or the possibility that snapback could even happen when you have two countries like Russia and China, which took literally years to bring on board on this kind of sanctions regime, and given that the Russians and Chinese have already made some interesting statements about this issue, what really is the reality of the snapback happening?
Yeah, it's an important issue, and even defenders of this deal, even former administration officials would say, well, exactly how this would work in practice has yet to be seen because we haven't done it. But so the first part of your question is the difficulty of building the sanctions regime in the first place, and it was incredibly difficult. In fact, I remember I was working on this issue in government in 2004, and the main issue at the time was how do we get a UN Security Council resolution against Iran's nuclear program? What is it going to take to get Russia and China to get on board with this? And so it's something we were thinking about seriously all the way back in 2004. It took us until 2006 to get the first UN Security Council resolution and sanction against Iran, but it wasn't really until 2012 that we got what I would call serious sanctions against Iran. So it really took us from the revelation of this enrichment program in 2002 until 2012, so almost 10 years to get tough sanctions on Iran. And what happened in 2012 is we got the European oil embargo, and Iran was kicked out of the SWIFT banking system, essentially cut off from the international banking system. And those are two of the things that really helped to crush Iran's economy. And it was hugely effective. It was only about a year later, after those sanctions went into effect, that we'd completely changed the domestic political dynamic in Iran. President Rouhani was elected, and that Iran came to the table and was willing to negotiate for the first time. And so only after a year with real sanctions, we had a real effect, and I'm afraid that we let up too early. I think if we'd continued on this path, that the Iranians would have been much more willing to make concessions, and especially given that oil is at only $50 a barrel now, which makes Iran's export much more difficult of oil. So, if we had known then what we know now, even some administration officials have said that it would have made sense to stay with the pressure track if we had known that oil was going to be dropping to that level. But now, once we get a deal and lift sanctions, even with the architecture in place, money is going to start flowing back in. So it's Russia and China, as you point out. China has this idea for a new Great Silk Road that's going to connect China to Europe through Central Asia, and it sees Iran as a major partner because it's one of the largest, most stable countries in the Middle East at the moment. So the Chinese are itching to get back in. I was in Beijing a few weeks ago, and this was a message I heard a lot. Go ahead and finish up this nuclear stuff because we're ready to do business with Iran. And it's not just Russia and China, though. Even our allies, so the South Koreans, the Indians, have been major purchasers of Iranian oil over time. Once they start importing more Iranian oil, it's going to mean practical changes on the ground in terms of refining and the way that oil is introduced into the market. So it's going to be difficult to snap it back into place to get those countries to reorient their economies away from Iran after they've just reoriented them back in. So in theory, the idea of snapback sounds nice. In practice, many sanctions experts I've talked to are skeptical that it will work. Yes, those are good points, and in fact, now that I think about it, those are things that I should have highlighted in my discussion of common criticisms of the deal, because this is something that often comes up, is that we're only addressing Iran's ability to produce the fuel for nuclear weapons. We're not addressing any of the other parts of Iran's behavior that we find objectionable, not the ICBM program, not its support for terror, not its abysmal human rights and democracy record inside the country. So to go to the ballistic missile threat, you're absolutely right that Iran is developing an intercontinental ballistic missile. The director of the U.S. Missile Defense Agency testified to Congress recently that by the end of the year, if Iran got outside help, it could conceivably have an ICBM capable of reaching the east coast of the United States. So often I think people think of the Iranian nuclear threat as a Middle East regional issue, or that something the United States is doing to protect its allies like Israel in the region. But that's not the way I see it at all. I see a nuclear-armed Iran posing a direct threat to U.S. interest and, moreover, even to the U.S. homeland. So I think the United States has strong reasons to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, even putting aside Israel and our regional partners. And you're also absolutely right that no country on Earth has ever developed ballistic missiles of this range without putting nuclear warheads on them. Not even the United States puts conventional warheads on ICBMs. There's been talk about conventional prompt global strike, but it's not something that we've done yet. So I think this is one piece of evidence among many that Iran is clearly interested in building nuclear weapons. These cover stories that this is a nuclear energy program just don't fly. And you mentioned my book earlier. In my book, I go through and list, I think, 8 technical reasons why what Iran is doing only makes sense for a nuclear weapons program, doesn't make any sense at all for a nuclear energy program. So the missile program is a problem. And then also Iran's malign influence in the region is a problem. It supports terror and proxy groups, destabilizing the region, contributing to a kind of Sunni-Shia civil war throughout the region. So I think these are things that the United States needs to address. I think it is a fair question as to whether these issues should be addressed in the nuclear negotiations or elsewhere. Because if we could get a nuclear deal that I kind of talked about in my remarks, where Iran agrees to give up its entire enrichment infrastructure, but didn't agree to curbs on its missile or terror program, in my view, that would still be something worth pursuing. So I don't think that a nuclear deal must necessarily include the missile program and terror, But I think those are things that need to be addressed in other ways. And so I think the United States needs to have a much better approach to the Middle East and to strategy in the region that allows us to both kind of counter and defeat ISIS, but also to counter Iran's malign influence in the region. And the Iranians are clearly very happy to negotiate and cooperate with us on the nuclear issue while competing in other areas, supporting their groups throughout the region. And I think there's no reason why we can't do the same. We can. I'm skeptical of these negotiations, as I said, but I would support other negotiations that had a more serious aim. But I think we can do that and counter Iran's malign influence in the region. I think that's what we should be doing. Well, Peter, thanks for calling in, and I know your work, and so thanks for the work you're doing in this area, and again, thanks for taking the time to call. So that is a potential concern that we strike this bad deal and Iran cheats and the game's over before 2016. So I think more congressional pressure would be helpful. So there are two potential avenues here. So one is Kirk-Menendez, as you point out. And then the second is this Corker bill, where Congress will have the ability to vote on this deal. So I think those are. I'm concerned about the way the negotiations are headed, as I made clear, and so I think if there's anything Congress can do to complicate this deal or stop it or keep the pressure on Iran despite this deal, that would be very welcome. I am concerned, as you are, that we might not have the votes. That with this Corker bill, for example, I think it's possible, if not likely, that we'd have a majority come out against it, but the president could veto it, and it doesn't look to me like we have a veto-proof majority, although that would depend, obviously, on the content of the deal, and I think the more members of Congress that can be persuaded that this is, in fact, a bad deal, this is, in fact, a historic agreement, and meaning a historically bad agreement, that maybe we could get that pressure. So I think we're absolutely on the same page that getting Congress to play a more active role in combating what's a bad deal may be the only thing that can save us. Yeah, good question. So the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has several articles. The first article, and the most important article, and it is, after all, named the Non-Proliferation Treaty, says that non-nuclear weapon states won't acquire nuclear weapons, and the nuclear weapon states won't help them to do that. But Article 4 says that at the same time, non-nuclear states have a, quote, inalienable right to peaceful nuclear technology. So this is what Iran points to when it claims that it has a right to enrich. That it's an inalienable right to have enrichment. But that's not the correct argument. One, because the NPT doesn't mention enrichment anywhere. The word enrichment doesn't appear anywhere in the treaty. And second, the United States has never interpreted Article 4 as granting an inalienable right to enrichment and reprocessing. As I pointed out, these sensitive nuclear technologies have essentially always been prohibited. So Iran is not on firm ground at all when it claims that it has a right to enrich. So if this deal allowed Iran explicitly to build nuclear weapons, that would be inconsistent with the NPT and inconsistent with international and domestic law, as you pointed out. But the deal doesn't say that Iran has a right to have nuclear weapons, to join the NPT as a nuclear weapon state or anything like that. Its explicit goal is to limit Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. So I don't think it's technically in violation of the NPT. But my concern, and many others' concern, is that even if that's not the intended effect, that it will set up Iran nicely to break out of the NPT and become a nuclear weapon state in the future, just because we're leaving it with a nuclear weapons capability, and again, giving that essential capability, even though it's not a nuclear weapon itself, but giving that capability to Iran, along with the international community's approval of that capability. Yes, well, my PhD dissertation and first book was called Exporting the Bomb, Technology Transfer and the Spread of Nuclear Weapons, which dealt with exactly this issue. Historically, why have countries cooperated on nuclear weapons programs? Why do they do it? What can we do to stop it? So this is something I've thought about quite a bit. And so, as you pointed out, these are countries that have participated in these illicit international nuclear markets in the past. They both got help from Pakistan and AQ Khan. North Korea has helped Syria build a nuclear reactor, has helped other countries with missile technology. And Iran, I think, would also be a country that would be at risk of exporting as well as importing some of this material. One of the things I worry about is Iran might transfer centrifuges or uranium enrichment technology to other countries. So North Korea-Iranian cooperation directly, it's something that I've always thought is plausible, given that these countries have participated in this kind of thing in the past. And there are more and more stories coming out about possible cooperation. So there was the Daily Beast article, as you point out, but I've seen other references in reliable sources recently. So it does seem to me more likely than not that there is some kind of cooperation going on, and that's a problem. But I think it's important to be clear about the problem, because I don't think that if Iranian officials are in North Korea working with the North Koreans on their nuclear program, I don't think that helps Iran very much in terms of building up a large fissile material production capability or a nuclear arsenal inside Iran. I think the production of material would largely still have to take place in Iran, but I think why it is a concern is that any of the technical difficulties that Iran is having with nuclear weapons design or with miniaturizing warheads, it could be getting that information from North Korea right now. So this goes to the possible military dimension aspect of the program. But I think if once Iran got the material, was able to produce the material within Iran, then it could move toward weaponization, I think, much more quickly because of the expertise it may be getting now from North Korea. So definitely an issue of concern, and like all policy issues dealing with North Korea, though, solution is difficult, but definitely something that we need to be aware of as we negotiate this deal with Iran. Yeah, it's a good question. So I think, from my contacts in the administration, it seems to be like there is something of a split on this issue. I think that there is widespread agreement that getting this deal is important for stopping the Iranian nuclear program, and that's the first priority. I do think there are also a significant subset that see this as historic in broader reasons, for broader reasons, that it would lead to potentially rapprochement between the United States and Iran, that this could change Iranian domestic politics, maybe moderate it, move it in a more moderate direction, and that Iran could become a strategic partner. Others I've talked to have said, well, that's not the goal, that the goal is just to solve the nuclear problem. If it were to lead to a change in Iran and to a new, more cooperative regime, that would be welcome, but that's not the intention, and so that the administration will continue to view Iran warily beyond the nuclear talks. I don't know which side will win out, but I think it would be dangerous, really, to try to view Iran as some kind of partner in the region, because really we're on all the major issues, as I see it, we're at loggerheads. On the nuclear negotiations, we have very different interests, and even if we get this deal, I think there's going to be a lot of tension in terms of monitoring and enforcing this deal over the coming years. I see it as a continuing source of tension if we get it, not something that provides a broader base of cooperation. And then, as I mentioned before, Iran's malign influence in the region is posing a threat to all of our traditional partners and allies, the Gulf states, Israel, Jordan, Egypt. And so I think protecting our traditional allies and combating Iran's malign influence needs to be an important part of our strategy, and the strategy for defeating ISIS. If we defeat ISIS and take territory from ISIS, but that's being controlled by Iranian proxy forces, I don't think that's in our interest or in our allies' interest in the region either. So I don't think this is the way the administration is thinking about it clearly, but my argument would be that our goals in the Middle East need to be to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons, counter Iran's influence, protect our traditional partners and allies, and defeat ISIS at the same time. Again, maybe in 2016 we'll get a better foreign policy. But I don't see the administration taking on all those tasks at once.